Hey, this is Clark with Pass the Baton, where we believe ministry is a relay, not a marathon. Following up with a video we did recently on Jesus, what Jesus had to say about church discipline. Today we're talking about what Paul said about church discipline. Now, we don't want to think that they're in contradiction to each other, but Paul says things a little different than Jesus. When Jesus, he's referring to when you have a problem with your brother. I think it's kind of a singular type of thing here. Paul, when he starts writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he says, it's reported among you, sexual immorality among you of the kind that's not even tolerated among the pagans, for a man to have his father's wife. Now, this is referring to his stepmother and a sexual promiscuity in that sense, which he says, under the Jewish law, they had about, I think there's like 19 different sexual sins that's mentioned in the book of Leviticus. And he's saying, a lot of those things under Roman law were okay. But even this was wrong under Roman law. I mean, even Nero wouldn't have allowed this, apparently. He said that even they don't like it. But then Paul gets into what he says is the biggest problem he's having with this, I think. Obviously it's wrong. Obviously he's saying this is wrong in the church for this to be going on. But then he says he says, are you arrogant? And you are arrogant. King James says puffed up, but you can see that picture of leaven that he talks about later. Leaven, oftentimes a picture of sin. When you have leaven in the dough, then it causes it to rise. It puffs up. And I think that's a picture we see here. But he says you're arrogant. Now, a lot of the problem that I have seen over the years with church discipline, and not saying it's never a time to do anything, but mostly what I have seen has been stories I've heard. I've seen little things over the years, but a problem I have with it is attitude. So often is the attitude and the presentation, how it's done. One thing I was thinking about the video I just talked about last week, when Jesus, when he says bring it before the church, which is the last step, I don't believe that means to take those people up in front of the church and have them confess in front of everybody. When you bring it before church, you let the church know so that each person can go to them and love them and try to bring them back, to reconcile them. Paul talks about this in Galatians 6. He said, if you see somebody, if a brother's overtaken in a fault, you with your spiritual restore them in the power of meekness, in the spirit of meekness, lest you yourself be tempted. He's saying you need to go to them. Instead of just kicking them out, go to them. And that confirms what Jesus was saying, was go to them first off. And Paul, when he's saying here, he says, and you're arrogant, ought you not rather to mourn? He says, you guys should be tore up about this. And I think, and Lord willing, in the next video, we're going to talk about something more practical along the lines of church discipline. And you don't want to miss it. If you want to hear that, you need to hit the subscribe button so you can catch that in the next video. And I think it's going to be coming from the whole aspect of where Paul says we are a body. And I want you just to see something very practical. I think it's very necessary that we need to consider when we're talking about church discipline. And here he says, you ought to mourn. Let him who's done this be removed from among you. And so Paul is extremely strict in what he's saying here, and he's referring to this body of believers. He said, let them be removed from among you. And he's referring to this body of believers. He said, let them be removed from among you. Now, I think he goes into some of these verses that are very hard to understand. I'm not even going to cover, for the most part, because this study, I just want to get to the basics of what Paul says here about his church discipline. But he says, your boasting is not good. He said, don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And so he's getting into that, where basically if this is going on and it's allowed to go on, then it's going to cause bigger problems. And I think that's probably true. But there's a way to do it, and I think that we are so often not to do it. We should be mourning over this, but it's not just the pastor's job to go to this person. It's the church's job. And Paul literally says this when he gets into 2 Corinthians, as he follows up on this. But he said, it's almost like Paul is moving, continually kind of changing a little bit on this. Literally, when you hear this, he says, In verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexual immoral people. Now, when he says I wrote to you in a letter, we don't have that. It's just one of those letters that we don't have. When we say 1 Corinthians, this is the first letter to the Corinthians that we have in our scripture. So he wrote something to them already. And he says not to associate with them, period. But now it's like he's correcting that. And in 2 Corinthians, he's even going to go a step further, as we'll see momentarily. But he says not at all meaning the sexual immoral of this world, or the greedy or swindlers or adulterers, since you would have to go out of the world. But now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother who does these things. So it's as if Paul told him in his first letter, don't associate with them at all. And now he's saying, okay, I understand that if this is going on, you have to associate to some extent. And literally, as I've said in so many videos, how else can we influence them unless we are friends with them? And I think we have Bible to back that up. But Paul's saying here, he says, don't associate with them if they're a brother. It's as if he's saying here in this letter that literally you have to distinguish the difference. If you're calling them brother and they're doing this thing, then that's not right. But we know people outside of the church are going to do it, because he says you can't get out of the world. But he's saying within that body of believers, it should be different. And it should be. And listen, I'm not 100% sure how to handle all these things. I just want to bring up in short what Paul says about it. He says, I wrote you this letter. He says, but now I'm writing you. And he goes on and talks about that. And he says, not even to eat with such a one. Now, something I think is a slight possibility. I don't think he's really what he's talking about, but it's worth mentioning. Some people think this is referring to communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or whatever you want to call it, because of what he says in the verses not long before this. He says, he talks about the Passover, and literally the Passover, that's what it was when Jesus at the Passover, and we said, now I'm taking this cup and it's new. I'm taking this do in remembrance of me. So our communion is about the Passover and how Jesus took that and changed it. Because it literally says here, now in verse 8 says, let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven. So he's referring to all that. And so I can see how this might be a slight possibility, although I don't think it's necessarily what he's talking about. But there are people that believe that. When it says don't eat with them, it means don't allow them to do the communion with you, or the remembrance of Jesus. But I think honestly, it's Paul saying, with your closeness to them, be careful with that, extremely careful. And that's what I want to talk about in the next video is how we can apply this. I think at least the best that we can here with this. But he says, don't eat with them. If it's a believer that's doing these things. Now, as I've said, is Jesus so often, he's like how Jesus would sit with sinners. But here, Paul is distinguishing the ones who say they're believers and those who are not believers, who's just doing these things. And then he goes, for what have I to do to judge outsiders? Is it not those inside the church we're to judge? And so he says, purge from among them. So now, I said all that. I said he was changing. So in 2 Corinthians, which, not to be overly funny, but the 2 Corinthians is the second letter after the first one. There may have been one in between, or some people think that's possible. But when you get into 2 Corinthians, which is the second letter that we have, it's written after the first one. Paul is writing here, and in verse 4, he says, for I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love I have for you. So Paul's referring to the last letter he wrote. He says, so if anyone's caused pain, he's caused it not to me, but in some measure, not to put it too severely, to all of you. And this goes into church discipline, that it's the body's, the whole church is supposed to come. And when Jesus says, to bring it before the church, that's the idea is not to bring the sinner or the person who has committed the offense in front of everybody and let them appeal, but it's to let everyone in the church know so that they can go to this person, the offender, and love them, trying to bring reconciliation from them, try to reform them. And I think if it happened that way, we would see a lot of differences. Instead of just bringing this person up to shame them in front of everyone, let the people know. And if people would do it correctly and go to them and love them and mourn over them instead of being prideful about what happened or prideful that they're not in it, but go to them correctly, I think we would see things completely change in this. And he says this, for such an one, the punishment by the majority is enough. So he said this person, and traditionally people believe he's talking about the same person that they disciplined in 1 Corinthians. But he said to this one, the majority, what the majority going to them was enough. It was enough. So in other words, everyone going to them in their own time, as he says in Galatians chapter 6 to do this because you love them, because you want to restore them, you want to bring reformation to them, reconciliation, because they went to them. He said this was enough for them. So the idea is that this person did repent. Now, obviously, this sin in 1 Corinthians, if it's the same person, was the person who was having a sexual relationship with his stepmother, and it says he quit doing this, and that's the idea. The idea is for the thing to stop, but I think where we go wrong so often is how we present it, our attitude behind it, and not doing it correctly, not really loving him, but putting it up to, the person to get up on stage, whether it's the pastor. A lot of people think it's the pastor's job. And listen, I'm a pastor, but it's everybody's job. And he said the majority went to them. And literally, the one pastor model, I don't believe is biblical anyway. And I've discussed this in another video. But here, the majority, if you're spiritual, as Paul said, go to them. So if you're not spiritual, sit back and listen. But you don't have anything to say if you're not willing to go to the person and try to make amends. That's what he says to do. And so he's referring to this person. And I have to get this in. I'm trying to make the video quick, but he says, the majority is enough, so you should rather turn to forgive and comfort him, or he may be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. He says forgive over and over and over. This is the message. It was the message that Christ was given, that Jesus was given in Matthew chapter 18. I think it's the message that Paul really wants to speak. It's not to say that we never go to people, but the problem is how we have handled it so often. And the church not going to rally around the person who is part of their body. It's part of their flesh. That's the idea of Paul, that Jesus and Paul both speak about the church being a body, and go to them. And so the idea is that this person would repent. I mean, it is the idea. It's not to just continue on in it. And I know we all fail. I know I fail at how to handle this so often, but I just want to talk about what it says. Anyone whom you forgive, I also forgive. So Paul wasn't even there. If you remember when he wrote the letter, he said, I've heard in 1 Corinthians. He says, I also forget. Indeed, what I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, has been for your sake in the presence of Christ, so that we would not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his designs. And so that's the idea, is, that the sin wouldn't just cause bigger and bigger and bigger problems, which often happens. It's hard to be someone who tries to handle these things. And I don't think it's one person's job. You should have a group of elders that discusses these things in depth at a local level within the body. But the church should rally around this person. They should try to bring reconciliation. If you're spiritual, then try to bring that reconciliation from this person. That's what literally, as Paul gets in, as he continues writing here, he refers to, I had a job to go preach the gospel, but I saw that Titus wasn't there. Now, Titus is, from my understanding, Titus was taking the letter to Corinth. And so Paul was worried that they were upset with him because of this letter. That's what the whole thing was about. So Paul wants to remind them and say, listen, this is what we need to do. So if you remember, as I said, Paul was constantly moving. He said, I wrote to you in the first letter, the letter which we don't have. He said, I wrote to you not to company with people that are doing this. He says, now I'm telling you not to company with a brother that's doing this. He says, now, in this letter that we have, which is at least the third letter to Corinth, he's literally saying, he said, I wrote this in verse 9 to you that I might test you and know whether you are obedient in everything. It literally sounds like Paul saying, I wrote for you to get rid of them just to see if you would be obedient. And now he says, anyone, he didn't use the word now, but he is saying so that you would forgive. And he says, anyone whom you forgive, I also forgive. So the idea is that this person repented, and Paul's saying, listen, you need, I mean, there's no, it doesn't say, and I think on in chapter 7, it talks about, because of the person that had repented, probably all talking about this same passage, this same person, same instance. And Paul this brings it down to this: forgive them. The whole idea is restoration, is bringing them back. And if you want to see the practical aspect, which hopefully be a little quicker video on the next one, see how we can do that as a body. You may be surprised with how I bring this out, somewhat with my background, but the thing is, we should be mourning about this and not just hoping to get somebody to just throw them out of the church so we can go on with our lives or whatever it is. We should be mourning, and the whole church should be mourning about it. It's just a sad reality, and I don't know where to draw all the lines, but I do know that you have to use Scripture to draw the lines. This is just a quick study, obviously in this group of studies, what Jesus said, what Paul said, and then I think the practical part of it. Thanks for listening, and if you want to follow up with the next one, please hit the subscribe button, hit the bell notification so you know when it comes out, and put any kind of comments into YouTube. So remember, ministry is a relay, not a marathon.